welcome to the ANA eLearning Academy. Today we're going to have Tom Sparks present with the Short Snorter Project. If you have any questions during this, you will be muted, so please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will read them at the end. Go ahead and get started. We're excited to hear what you got to talk about.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, great. So, welcome. Happy Friday from downtown Bozeman, Montana. Thanks for joining. Basically, I'm going to go through the Short Snorter Project, Still Keeping the Memories Alive book that was published back in August after the Newman Numismatic Portal presentation we did. And this is available through the Newman Numismatic Portal. So this is an effort that took me about almost 20 years to put together. And I figured with the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, it's a good time to publish something that people could have the answers to the questions about what is a short snorter and why is it significant. So the mission of the project is to educate the general public about the tradition, the individuals, and the artifacts. I've got a table of contents in the book. We'll go through the definitions and the backgrounds and the origins and how it expanded into World War II. A couple of specifics about some key snorters in my collection. And then a lot of photos, images, press photos, examples of short snorters, and let's get at it. So what is a short snorter? It's a banknote signed by various persons who met together or made to commemorate a special event like a solo flight, crossing the equator or the ocean. The banknotes can be from any country, and some commemorative short snorters are actually not banknotes. Short snorter can be a single note, or it can be a long chain of notes connected together. I've seen a few of them that were stapled, but mostly they're taped. And that's one of the actual things that would identify the originality of is the fading and yellowing of the tape. Where does that term short snorter come from? Well, aviation and alcohol do not mix. Short snort slang for a small shot of liquor. It pointed to one's moderation, especially with aviation, where pilots would call each other short snorter because they were known to only take a short snort. Here's an example of a short snorter that belonged to Captain Thomas O. Pierce. This is a snort of whiskey he was taking to calm the nerves after a bombing mission over Italy when he was in the North African campaign. Also, a short snorter is a person who's been initiated into the tradition by other short snorters who are members in good standing, meaning they had their membership card or their autographed dollar bill with them. Example of an ad that was published in 1944, the verbiage with that, the caption of the picture when the short snorters met and compare their autographed dollar bills, have a Coke. I'm not going to do an advertisement for Coca-Cola, but you get the idea. It was a real popular thing back in the 40s. This was published in the Minneapolis Star Journal. Here's an example of a short snorter membership card that was made by the U.S. Air Force Air Transport Command. This one was unused, but it would certify that a person had crossed an ocean on a date, and it would be signed by 3 people. In this case, the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and you'd have to pay them each $1 to become a member. So it was kind of a way to make a little profit on the side. And then this is an example of a brochure with an actual short snorter note that was inside of it that TWA would hand out to folks who are flying across the ocean. And the verbiage of what was in that brochure is published here. So for your reading pleasure at a future point in time. The origins of the traditions, three schools of thought: the barnstormers, the bush pilots, or the balloonists. I'll touch first on the barnstormers. Who were these guys? Well, they were pilots who had flown usually in World War I. There was a whole bunch of surplus military aircraft you could buy really cheap. You could operate in a farmer's field by paying that farmer a few bucks, advertise by dropping leaflets over a town nearby. You'd perform aerial stunts and give airplane rides, and they'd form larger teams into flying circuses. There was an article published in November 2002 by Michael Murata in the Numismatist. This is where I first read about short snorters. Really good article, explains the barnstormer theory of the origins of the tradition and how men would document history on their short snorters. This is a barnstormer snorter that circulated in 1931. It was signed by Wiley Post and Harold Gatty, who were the first gentlemen to fly around the world in the Winnie Mae. Also signed by Tex Rankin, who taught Jimmy Stewart how to fly. Dorothy Hester, Ruth Nichols. We'll touch on some of these people here in the next couple of pages. So Wiley Post and Harold Gatty posing in front of the Winnie Mae. Dorothy Hester, she got her start jumping out of airplanes with a parachute and then learned how to fly and did a lot of barrel rolls to set a record. Ruth Nichols was called the Flying Debutante. Mrs. Freddie Lund, she was the widow of Freddie Lund, who died in an air race. Al Williams, who was one of the first Navy test pilots. And then also Ken Hunter, who was one of the aerial refueling pioneers. I couldn't figure if that was the right way to post the picture or not, you know, if you're using gravity tanks. Clyde Pangborn was one of those early barnstormers, the first to fly nonstop between Japan and the United States. He landed his plane in Wenatchee, Washington after 41 hours and 13 minutes. Basically, they were trying to land in Seattle. It was all fogged in, so they went to Boise. That was fogged in. They came back to the Tri-Cities area. That was fogged in, and they ran out of gas in Wenatchee, which is why Clyde Pangborn International Airfield is in Wenatchee. The bush pilots. So there was this need after World War I also to transport passengers and mail in Alaska and also to explore and map northern Canada. They operated in the bush, which was remote and hospitable. They didn't have many landing strips. There was a lot of gold miners that were near the water. Medical supplies for Native Alaskans in the territory were ferried by various Mercy pilots, and they had special gear for their airplanes. This origination was published in 1941, the Miami Herald, and it talks about Corey Ford, who worked for Collier's magazine, and some of the short snorters he met while he was up in Alaska. And I actually have a short snorter signed by Corey Ford. But it also talks about being founded in 1925 by a group of pilots in Alaska, among which was Joe Crossan, man who made world headlines by his many Mercy flights through the frozen north. He's the man who flew the bodies of Will Rogers and Wiley Post back to civilization after their crash. Remember? And it talks about the rules for membership. You had to be engaged in aviation, be initiated by 3 short snorters in good standing. The membership card was a US $1 bill. The fee was $3, one to each initiator. You'd have to have that on your person at all times, or be able to produce it within 2 minutes if you were in the shower. And if you didn't, you'd have to produce a dollar bill or a drink. And if you didn't pay up, you were branded a short changer. They even had their own official logo. So I'd never seen or heard of a short snorter surviving from an original bush pilot until June 30th, 2015, at my mother's funeral service. My cousin came up to me and she says that she worked with this gal at Seattle Times whose dad was a bush pilot, and she had a short snorter. And I asked, who is that person? And she said her name was Joe Crossan. I said, oh my gosh, that is the Holy Grail. So I contacted her and we set up a meeting, and this is a fragment of Joe Crossan's short snorter. And this was started pre-November 1929. How do I know that? Well, it's signed by Ben Eielson, Carl Ben Eielson. And I'm going to go into a little bit of the background of Ben Eielson and his relationship with Joe Crossan. But he basically died in a crash November 9th, 1929. Ben Eielson and Sir Hubert Wilkins flew over the North Pole from Alaska to Spitsbergen. They were the very first in April 1928, and then they were going to target flying over the Antarctic in 1928. So in September, they formed a Wilkins-Hurst expedition, and Ben Eielson asked Joe Crossan, who he'd been partnering with up in Fairbanks, Alaska, to join the expedition. And so this is some material that came out of Joe Crossan's scrapbook that's on loan from the daughter. And you can see all the different pictures that he'd taken while he was down in the Antarctic, and what they had done when they were down in the Antarctic. And it's interesting because he was down there at the same time that Richard Byrd was down there and doing their expedition. And then in 1929, Ben Eielson was awarded the Harmon Trophy, which was awarded annually to the person making the biggest impact in aviation internationally. And this is from a newspaper that was published, but this is the actual press photo that was in the estate of Joe Crossan that shows President Herbert Hoover shaking hands with Ben Eielson, and it's actually signed by Herbert Hoover. This is in what I believe to be a White House photograph. So Ben Eielson and the Fairbanks Airplane Company contracted to salvage the cargo of that Nanook that was stuck in the Russian Siberian ice for $50,000 in November 1929. Joe Crossan was part of that endeavor. And then Ben Eielson and his mechanic, Earl Borland, crashed on November 9th, and Joe Crossan led the 3-month search to find the bodies. And he was the one that spotted the wing of Ben Eielson's Hamilton metal plane sticking out of the snow. And then the Russians labored for 24 days to find their bodies. They had to thaw them out, lay them straight, and they made American flags to return them back for their journey home. So the loss of Ben Eielson was a close personal friend of Joe Crossan, was the first of several for him. The other part of his snorter is, besides Earl Borland, but it's also signed by a lot of other famous early Alaskan bush pilots, and Hap Arnold, who was a general of the U.S. Army Air Corps, the 5-star general during World War II, and signed by Mae Post, the wife of Wiley Post. Here's an actual photo from the estate that has Wiley Post, no eye patch. He only wore his eye patch when he was going to fly because he had a glass eye that would get cold and give him a headache. And then in 1935, Wiley Post, who was friends with Will Rogers, came up to Alaska, and this is an actual photo, a selfie taken by the photographer, D.R. Gustafson, of the 4 of them. And this is one of the last photos taken before Post and Rogers went to fly over the Arctic. And he crashed his plane in Barrow, and Joe Crossan was the gentleman that went up to Barrow to retrieve the bodies and brought them back to Seattle. Some of the other autographs on here, you might have heard of Ween Air Alaska. Well, that was Ralph Ween, who actually died in 1930, had signed this short snorter. Some really significant bush pilots. One of the other ones interesting was a fellow named Dapper Daniel Barnett. He was a friend of Charles Lindbergh. He was an employee of Ryan Aeronautical, and he designed the wing of the Spirit of St. Louis. And I learned that he had given Charles Lindbergh a $1 bill and a letter, and asked them to fly them over the Atlantic in a red carnation. And that was the first flower to fly across the Atlantic. And Lindbergh, when he came back, it was said that he gave that dollar bill to Sir Hubert Wilkins. Remember, we talked about Hubert Wilkins and the Antarctic expedition that Joe Crossan was a part of. So I kind of wonder, is that where Joe Crossan learned about the short snorter tradition? This is an interesting short snorter that was made by Joe Crossan. for a gentleman named AB. A lot of times that is what they do. They just put the initials on it. And this was a special flight to Fairbanks in a new Pacific Alaska Airways Electra. And this came into my possession through a young man that it showed up at one of the PNNA coin shows. And he had got this in change in a bank in Edmonds, Washington. And I ended up having to trade him a short snorter autographed by The Voice. Name escapes me right now. I know that everyone out there knows Frank Sinatra. Thank you. Yeah, just some of the people that had shined that short snorter. And this is another photograph out of Joe Crossan's estate of Hap Arnold, personalized to Joe Llewellyn. He was only a 2-star general at the time, so that puts it about 1940. And this is another short snorter that was in Joe Crossan's estate, and it's on a Japanese 50-sen note that was liberated from the island of Attu shortly after it was liberated in 1943. Interesting thing about it is it's laminated. And you see also in the image to the right, it says up on the top, JEC, that's Joe E. Crossan, Attu, Alaska. Some interesting folks had signed that snorter. Roger Q. Williams, very famous aviator. Joe Doolittle, who was the wife of Jimmy Doolittle. Billy Parker, who was a member of what they call the early birds. These were pilots who flew before December 17th, 1916. And Hank Hollenbeck, who's a Pioneer, Montana aviator. And so I have to do a little bit more research now that I live in Bozeman. Also on the back is signed by Willis Cleaves and Buckshot Lean, personal friends of the Crossan family. If you ever get a chance and you love to read about early aviation, this is a fantastic book. Joe Crossan's sister Marvell was the first female pilot in Alaska. And the very first women's national air race was in 1929. Will Rogers had called it the Powder Puff Derby, and she crashed and died on day 2. So Joe Crossan was no stranger to deaths in aviation. So what about the balloonists? This is an interesting area that no one's ever really touched upon. Balloons were used by the French back in the 1790s for observation, and then they were used by the North in the Civil War for artillery spotting and aerial reconnaissance. And there was a lot of balloons, I didn't even know this, that were used by U.S. Army in 1918 over in World War I. 36 balloon companies overseas. This is an interesting snorter that I picked up off of eBay. It was one of these buy it now things. And I had never seen a large size Series 1923 note that had the word short snorter written on it. So I started doing a little research, and I found a name of Captain Edgar P. Sorensen, and I got a hit. And he grew up in Whatcom County, which is the Bellingham, northern Washington state area. And he had served in the Coast Artillery at Fort Casey, which is a popular state park out here. And it's also signed by Herb Maxson and W.T. Van Orman, who was a very well-known gentleman that worked for Goodyear, quite an inventor. Here's a picture of Edgar P. Sorensen in 1921 at Army Balloon School. Here's Ward Van Orman and Herb Maxson at the 1926 International Balloon Race. Interesting story about Herb Maxson was he was the co-pilot for John Botner, and they had lifted off and the balloon was icing up. And so they started to jettison the ballast, which is these white bags sitting down at the bottom of the balloon. And so when they hit the ground and crashed, Maxson fell out and the balloon rose rapidly, and then it popped, and Botner bailed out with a parachute, which saved his life. And he became known as a member of the Caterpillar Club, which was a designation given to folks who parachute out of a doomed aircraft and survive with the use of parachute. Life depends on a silken thread, because parachutes at the time were made out of silk and not nylon like they were in World War II. So the tradition started to expand in the 30s with the growth of the commercial aviation and flying boats, Pan American, Trans World Airlines, and British Overseas. You've got these long flights over water. What are you going to do? If you're a member of the Short Snorter Club already, you're going to go out and solicit if anyone else wants to join the club. You make $3 off of, you make $1 off everyone who wants to join, and they would start these different chapters. And short snorters from pre-World War II, so pre-1940, are extremely rare. I've only seen maybe a handful of them. About half of those are in my collection. This is one that was notated March 4th, 1939, Honolulu, San Francisco, Pacific Chapter, and it's signed by Robert Armstrong, who was in the RKO Pictures King Kong in 1931. And so then with the entry of the US into World War II and all these different types of overseas flights, you've got the US Army Air Corps. A bomber has 8 to 10 crew members. There might be some additional folks just making the trip. You got the Naval Air Transport Service, the Army Transportation Command, the Women's Air Service pilots, American Red Cross, and the USO. All these folks are flying overseas. They all become short snorters. I shouldn't say all, but a lot. And then it spread into other branches of the military service. I've seen Army Air Corps, Army, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine, all in even some of the foreign services. This is an interesting one. This is a gentleman who was also a short snorter and a purple porpoise, Harry Reavers. What's a purple porpoise? Well, if you cross the junction of the equator and the international date line at the sacred hour of the vernal equinox, the 21st of March, you're entitled to become a purple porpoise. And in so doing, anyone else, basically, a golden dragon, a green turtles, short snorters, they have to give you a free noggin of grog as a measure of proper respect, which is basically a drink. So then this tradition had spread to other countries, the UK, United Kingdom, all the British Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, China, USSR, supposedly Germany. I've never seen an actual, what I would call a Nazi-owned short snorter, but I've heard that the tradition spread to Germany. Winston Churchill, he was actually a popular short snorter. I've seen articles and books about him. This is an interesting short snorter that was made on Japanese invasion money. It's got Mickey Mouse wearing a crush cap, piloting a B-24 Liberator with the tail insignia of the 90th Bomb Group, Jolly Rogers. Disney and Disney Nose Art was very popular with all branches of the service. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about George J. Grimm and his short snorter. And why I'm keying on this one was after reading that article in 2002, written by Michael Murata, I went up to visit George Grimm, and I didn't know at the time that he had even served in World War II. So he was born on this farm in Arlington, Washington, and he studied at Curtis Wright Technical Institute, was in the Boeing Company working in the Red Barn, and he joined the Falcon Flyers. And he was there, he soloed on November 7th, 1941, exactly 1 month before Pearl Harbor. And after the bombing, he entered the Naval Reserve to become a naval aviator, and he trained at several bases, and he learned to fly the PBY-5A, but then he was assigned when he was in the Naval Air Transport Service, or NATS, to the Consolidated PB-2Y Coronado Flying Boat. And he was with VR-2 Squadron in the Pacific Theater. And then in June of 45, he was assigned to Squadron VRJ, which their role was to fly around admirals and high-ranking VIPs. Well, long story short, George flew Fleet Admiral Nimitz and his staff into Tokyo Bay for the surrender of the Japanese. And as a kid, I worked on his farm for 2 summers, and George never said a word about it. And when I discovered this and was, knew that he knew Nimitz, I asked him if he had a short snorter. He says, well, how'd you know about that? I said, well, I read about it last year. And so he gets out this scrapbook and he's going through it and he's showing me pictures of Nimitz getting out of the staff car and going through the cockpit and or across Tokyo Bay. And then he gets out his short snorter and it's signed when he's soloed by Art J. Bell. And on the second note, it was signed by Major Joe Foss, who was a Medal of Honor winner for his acts of heroism down in the Guadalcanal. The third note is signed by members of VRJ1. And I can't read the top of this because of the menu, but this one's signed by Raymond Spruance, John Towers. And then this is the really interesting note. This is the one that has Chester Nimitz, C.W. Nimitz, en route Saipan to Tokyo, 29 August 1945. And then a lot of other signatures of guys that were in his crew. John Towers, another 4-star admiral. Another note in his short snorter. There's 10 notes in George's short snorter. This one's signed by DeWitt Clinton Ramsey, James Kaufman, Gilchrist Stockton. These are pictures from George Grimm's photo album at Yokosuka Navy Base at the time of the surrender. Fleet Admiral Nimitz, Richard Byrd. There's 12 flag rank admirals and generals that had signed George's short snorter. And there's also 4 recipients of the Medal of Honor. J.H. Fellows, Dick Johnston, it was a war correspondent. Oscar Badger, Medal of Honor recipient. Oscar Badger, a little story about him and what he was awarded the Medal of Honor for in the Veracruz operation in 1914. It's interesting that the USS Utah, my son is stationed over in Hickam Air Force Base, and just last week he sent me a picture of the USS Utah, what remains of the hulk of it that was destroyed in Tokyo Bay. Thomas G.W. Settle, interesting signature there. I'll touch on him here in a little bit. There's George Grimm with the Congressional Tour to China in 1946. So Thomas G.W. Settle, senior officer on the USS Los Angeles dirigible, and it was tied to a mooring mast that stood on its nose. And really interesting story. If you get a chance to do a little background research on that, that would have been an amazing sight to see. Some other high-ranking VIPs that had signed George's short snorter. And Derrick Old Truck at Grimm's Farm in 1961. Shortly thereafter, George took the family to see Admiral Nimitz down, who was living in Berkeley. And that was even published in the local paper. And here's the photo that's in his albums that Nimitz inscribed to George about George's, being a part of that signing ceremony in an indirect way. Even though he was not at the ceremony, he was standing on his plane out in Tokyo Bay. There's another snorter that came into my possession recently, and it belonged to this gentleman, Boyd Egner, who lived in the Bothell area of Washington, and it's a member of the VC 70th Scorpions, and did a little research and found out that these were guys that were part of this flyover of the Japanese surrender ceremony. George had told me about this. He said that there was 450 carrier planes from the Third Fleet that passed in formation at low level over the battleship USS Missouri, and then Air Force B-29 bombers flew by. And this was to underscore the power that the Japan had awakened from their slumber and to make sure that peace would be upon the island. This is another snorter signed by a bunch of chiefs that were sitting in Tokyo Bay. during the surrender. Interesting inscription. Some of them say UDT 24. That's the underwater demolition team. That was a precursor to the Navy SEALs. Now, this is an interesting snorter that's on loan to the Short Snorter Project. We've had it for a couple of years now. And it tells a incredible story about a gentleman who was a P-38 pilot, an only child. He entered in May 42. He was assigned to the 83rd Pursuit Squadron. George C. Richards, only son. This was sent to me by video, and it had some, the video streaming of the images. And I said, well, this is really interesting, because it's got dates and it's got locations and it's got groups, fighter groups and fighter squadrons, and it's very well documented. And, it was even signed by Bob Hope, and probably signed when Bob Hope was doing a camp show tour in Casablanca. It also has a notation about Marshal Smuts escorting Marshal Smuts. He was a senior ranking military man from South Africa. And then it gets into this note that's got locations in Italy. Foggia was a big air base in southern Italy from where the Allies operated bomber command and fighter groups trying to end the war. But this was the last letter written on January 4th, 1944, somewhere in Italy by George Richards to his mom and dad. And on February 5th, they received a telegram from the Western Union saying that George was missing in action since January 10th over Bulgaria. And so there was a lot of correspondence in the memoirs, the collection of this family that had been passed down to nieces and cousins and had sat in a trunk for 30 years. And then it came to light, and we put a really good exhibit, 3-panel exhibit together. And that's on loan indefinitely until there's a young man who's about, I think he's 7 years old now. At some point in time, he'll become it'll be back to him as the owner of this short snorter, and he can carry on the story. But there's some details in the book about this bombing raid. This picture was the last taken on the day before his last mission. And this picture was actually on the inside of the memorial material that was used at his service 5 years after he was declared dead. Yeah, 1948. I'm sorry, it was 3 years after, about 3 years after he was declared killed in action. So this was a tough one to put together because there was a lot of information, and trying to display how to tell the story and do honor to his memory and the family that was keeping these artifacts. So I'll touch now on some war correspondence short snorters. So there's a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt signing some short snorters at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, and one of the gentlemen there has a war correspondent badge on. And I'm sorry about that. Okay, so Edgar Rice Burroughs. I purchased this short snorter, signed by Joe DiMaggio, and Edgar Rice Burroughs turned up on this short snorter. I didn't even know he was a war correspondent. He's known for his novels Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. Here's one that's signed by William Randolph Hearst Jr., who was a war correspondent. This is an interesting one on loan. It's signed by Ernest Hemingway. And he was working for Colliers, and he observed the DD landings from offshore. And when the gentleman that loaned this to me sent me the pictures, I examined the back, and it's also signed by Glenn Miller. So, you know, one of my favorite all-time big band musicians. And he went missing over the English Channel on December 5th, 1944. And who knows, maybe this was his very last signature. Ernie Pyle, another famous war correspondent who also won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, Brave Men. If you are interested in World War II history, I strongly suggest reading Ernie Pyle. You can see he had an interesting name, interesting signature to his name, which was validated by a Chesterfield cigarette ad in one of the periodicals of the time. He was killed April 18th, 1945. I was actually giving a talk at a senior home, a retirement home, and one of the gentlemen up in the front said that he saw Ernie Pyle the day before he was shot on Iwo. I thought that was interesting. So we'll touch on some of the VIP short snorters. This one was the Burma Roadsters. It's signed by Frank Merrill and R.A. Wheeler. Frank Merrill, as you know, is Merrill's Marauders. One of the interesting thing about this short snorter, if you see down in the lower half, the stars around the outside, what I learned from George Grimm's short snorter is that a lot of times if there was a VIP that signed a short snorter, they'd put a star next to the name, or maybe the number of stars representing how many, what their flag rank was. And this is a Ledo Road short snorter. It was published in an article written by Dr. Kerry Rogers. He donated it to me. It's signed by Lord Louis Mountbatten and all the folks that were really involved with building the Ledo Road, which was kind of a sub part of the Burma Road. And there's a Air Force picture down in the lower left showing how they had to build that road and why the patch is the way it is. Here's a press photo of Carl Spaatz signing Jimmy Doolittle short snorter. I met his granddaughter and I asked her about his short snorter. She said, I think it's at the Smithsonian. I contacted them and they actually said, well, no, we got a lot of short snorters at the Smithsonian, a lot of them in storage, but we don't have Jimmy Doolittles. So that short snorter is actually missing in action. This short snorter, you can see that some of the stars on there in the margins next to some of the names. Ralph Royce, interesting gentleman there. He flew, learned to fly in 1915, and he was with the 1st Aero Squadron down on the Texas border in the what they call the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa. My grandfather also served down there. And one of the things I brought to Montana is a picture of him with 80 horses side by side of the 1st Texas Cavalry at Camp Bowie in part of that expedition. Richard Sanders, he reached Brigadier General rank at 28 years, 9 months. That's just phenomenal. This short snorter was actually purchased by a very prominent coin dealer named Rick Snow. And it's signed by 13 flag rank admirals and generals, including Admiral William Frederick Bull Halsey. Definitely a very colorful gentleman during World War II, one of Nimitz's right-hand men. You can see Halsey's signature there. The short snorter signed by Bob Hope, George S. Patton Jr. twice, and Bing Crosby. And I think what happened with Patton was he signed the signature in the portrait of Washington, and you couldn't really read it, so he signed it again just under the portrait. And he used a different signature than he normally would. He used a signature that he would use for what I would call a familiar face, or like that he would use to write a letter to his mother. Here's a press photo of Louis Mountbatten signing a short snorter for a gentleman in Washington, D.C. Ernest King signing a short snorter for a Marine Corps combat photographer. Hap Arnold signing a short snorter for Major Richard Bong. He was #1 flying ace, 39th Fighter Squadron. There were some other gentlemen that were in the 39th Fighter Squadron flying down in New Guinea. It's interesting because Charles W. Snarlin Charlie King's son had sent me the image of this $20 short snorter, which is like a month's wages. And it's signed by a gentleman named John Dunbar, who I was able to contact, and he was alive at the time. And he had a short snorter signed by Charlie King. So that was really interesting. A lot of fun with putting that one together. Short snorter, this is signed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This was donated by Dusty Royer, memory of his good friend, fellow coin dealer, Mike Payton. This is a press photo of Dwight D. and Mamie Eisenhower signing Cardinal Spellman short snorter. Vice President Henry Wallace signing a short snorter for a couple of Army Air Corps pilots. Short snorter signed by Cider Joe Stillwell. Now, Cider Joe was the son of Vinegar Joe. He wasn't as, didn't have as rough an edge as Vinegar Joe. So that's why his name was Cider Joe. James Roosevelt, oldest son of Franklin D., signing a short snorter for some fellows with the Army Transport Command. His little brother, Elliot Roosevelt, signing a short snorter. Harry Truman signing a short snorter. This is actually after the war. A couple of guys decided to, I think they flew some Cessnas around the world or something like that. And so they paid a visit. Here's a short snorter that was an eBay find signed by Gerald R. Ford. And it's interesting because it says, it's dated up there, 12/24/44 Ulithi to Pearl Harbor. And looking at Gerald R. Ford's bio, on December 24th, 1944 at Ulithi, Ford was detached from the ship and sent to Navy pre-flight school. Of all the presidential short snorters, or I'm sorry, of all the presidential signatures, Gerald Ford's is worth the least. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Okay, chapter 8, we're going to talk about the Hollywood actors serving in uniform. This is a short snorter that's signed by James Stewart. This is while he was serving with the 8th Air Force in Southern England. He was stationed at Old Buckingham. A.E. Minyard was at Old Buckingham during this period of time. And it's his short snorter is signed by Ray L. Sears. And there's a picture of Ray L. Sears being debriefed by James Stewart. This short snorter is signed by Clark Gable and Andrew McIntyre. It belonged to Gordon L. Jacobs, who was at Camp 7 Mile, which was part of Geiger Field in Spokane. And this was signed while Clark Gable was filming Combat America, which was a documentary that was made to recruit tail gunners, waist gunners for bombers. This is a photo that came with that short snorter showing Lieutenant Gable, labeled as a student, and Lieutenant McIntyre, also a student, and Gordon Jacobs, who's the gentleman kneeling with the black CPOs and the high pressure cap. Clark Gable flew 5 combat missions. This is one that shows him with the crew of the B-17 Delta Rebel II. This came out of the Boeing archives. This is a short snorter signed by Jackie Coogan. For those of you who aren't familiar with the name Jackie Coogan, he started off as a child actor, very popular with Charlie Chaplin, and made a lot of money as a child actor, and his parents really swindled it out of him in a way. But he joined the 1st Air Commandos, and in 1943, volunteered to participate in a dangerous mission called Operation Broadway, which was a drop. He was a glider pilot, 150 miles behind Japanese lines. And picture of Jackie Coogan there. You know, he was a tough character. For those of you who don't know, Jackie Coogan, later in life, was Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. Here's a short snorter signed by Henry Fonda when he was in the Navy, and Charles Lindbergh. This belonged to Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wicks, who was a Navy pilot. And interesting story about this is the gentleman who I acquired this from, the son of Wesley Wicks. He says he remembers as a 3-year-old sitting on Charles Lindbergh's lap playing with his pocket watch. Lindbergh has an interesting wartime biography. He wasn't even allowed to enlist, but he participated as a consultant, and through that flew missions in P-38 Lightnings in the Far East. This is Wesley Wicks having a short snorter signed by Jack Benny. This is some of the other signatures on Wesley Wicks' short snorter. Jerry Colonna, Tony Romano, Bob Hope, Francis Langford, Carol Landis. Here's a short snorter signed by Gilbert Rowland, who played the Cisco Kid. And the interesting signature on here is Robert Ford, PAA. So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, he was flying a Boeing 314, the Pacific Clipper, from New Zealand eastbound around the world. And he was ordered after the attack that he was to complete that trip eastbound. And so this 30,500 mile trip without charts, without knowing where they're going to refuel, became the first round the world commercial flight. Short snorter signed by Brad Skelton, Clem Clediddlehopper. Short snorter signed by Melvin Douglas, Mary Landa, Ben Blue, Ruth Dennis. They were with the USO Camp Shows tour, number 279. Lanny Ross signed short snorter, also a picture of him signing the short snorter of Irving Berlin. What about American sports figures in uniform? Jack Dempsey, he served with the Coast Guard Reserve, rose to the rank of a commander. Jackie Robinson, he was in the Army and with the tank folks. I thought this was kind of neat, in his bio, which I read on Baseball in Wartime, which is a fantastic website, talks about his experience and when he was court-martialed for not yielding and moving to the back of the bus. And just that really interesting story. This short snorter had belonged to a combat photographer. And whenever there was someone who was very famous, one of his assignments was to go out and take pictures. So this short snorter is 10 notes long, and it's signed by Richard Byrd, C.W. Nimitz, Jimmy Doolittle, or not Jimmy, James Doolittle, Ira Eaker, a lot of big name performers. But the other short snorter that I wanted to point out was Hank Greenberg. Hank Greenberg was the first Jewish American superstar in sports. The Hammer in Hebrew was his nickname, and quite a patriot. And he spent some time flying B-29s in the China, Burma, India theater of operations. And when Jackie Robinson broke into the major leagues in 1947, Hank Greenberg was the first guy to welcome him with open arms, probably because he knew what it was like to go through discrimination on the ballpark. This press photo is dated March 5th, 1944. It's got a bunch of U.S. Marine Corps officers looking at a short snorter that belonged to Colonel R.E. Dick Hanley, who was a Northwestern University football coach before the war, and a bunch of other famous athletes, including Ted Lyons, who pitched for the Chicago White Sox. This is a short snorter that came to me off of eBay, and it's signed by a bunch of baseball players that were with the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet Team. And also it's signed by an interesting character, guy named Charlie Plum, who wrote the comic strip Ella Cinders. This short snorter signed by Leo DeRocher and Johnny Vandermeer. Interesting character, Johnny Vandermeer, the only Major League Baseball player to ever throw back-to-back no-hitters. And Joe Medwick had signed this, and then also Captain Herbert R. Sensenig, who was the chief interrogator at the Nuremberg trials for the Nazi war criminals. This one is signed by some guys that played in the 1944 World Series, Johnny Lindell, Tuck Stainback. And then close to my heart is a guy named Beans Reardon, because I umpire Little League Baseball. He was a National League umpire. He was the umpire that was behind the plate when Babe Ruth hit his last home run. And this is a picture that was published in the Post called Bottom of the Sixth. He was known as the last cussing ump. And he was asked by the police one time after a game up in Canada if he wanted an escort to the parking lot. And he told them, I didn't sneak in, and I sure as hell ain't going to sneak out. Here's one of the photos from them on that USO trip in the South Pacific. Joe DiMaggio having his short snorter signed. And then some short snorters belong to some of the Hollywood USO performers. John Garfield, signed probably at the Hollywood Canteen. Danny Thomas, who traveled with Marlene Dietrich, and another singer and actor, Milton Frome. Marlene Dietrich short snorter, I heard a rumor that this sold fairly recently at auction for a sum of over $5,000. I don't know if that's true or not. Short snorter signed by Humphrey Bogart. He performed his service with the Navy in World War I, but then he performed with the USO and traveled to North Africa in World War II. Livy de Havilland, she recently passed away July 26th of last year. She was with the Hollywood Victory Caravan, and this was a picture of her signing a short snorter up in Alaska. Edgar G. Robinson, wise guy. Frederick March, Dana Andrews, Jeannie Darrell. The Andrews sisters, everyone's probably familiar if you're my age or more with the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. Ray Milland and Randolph Scott, some very famous actors. Short snorter signed by a lot of the folks that you would see traveling with Bob Hope. Louise Rainier, Joseph Kalia, the first actress to win more than one Academy Award and first to win back-to-back. Interesting short snorter signed by Roy Acuff, the king of country music. And Arnold First, who was a famous magician who had the white rabbit trick. Watch me pull a rabbit from my hat. Benny Goodman. I know that Joe Bowling is very familiar with this picture of Una Merkel. I believe Joe owns that short snorter. Here's a picture of Gary Cooper, Una Merkel, and Phyllis Brooks down under. And they would gather a group around them to sign short snorters. This is a picture of the crowd around them at Milne Bay, New Guinea, December 7, 1943. Shirley Temple. This is actually from a movie, but they're signed up to get their short snorter signed, and man, she is signing Jerry Shane's short snorter. Short snorter signed by Frank Sinatra. This is not the one I traded away. Also signed by the other members of his troupe. Just a press photo of some comedians with a long short snorter. Another gal, Dorothy Wenzel, who spent 10 years on the road with the USO and her short snorter. Bob Hope and Jerry Colonna examining a short snorter. John W. Wild Bill Crump from Edmonds, Washington, and his short snorter is signed by Bob Hope. This is a picture of Wild Bill Crump with his pet mascot, Jeep, who was a coyote pup that he got from Eastern Washington and smuggled overseas in his gas mask bag. Flew 5 combat missions with him. And Wild Bill Crump's short snorter is also signed by a gentleman named Lieutenant William C. Buchek, who did his 35 missions, and then he was serving with a group that was flying P-51D Mustangs, and one of the wings of his aircraft fell off, and he perished in that flight. Funny story about this is I worked with a gentleman at the Boeing Company who is the great nephew of William C. Buchek, Scott Buchek, who had never met his great uncle, of course, because he perished during the war. And Scott has a P-51 painting hanging in his office, and he was just amazed that this surfaced and brought him a lot of joy. This is a short snorter that was owned by Folly Langley, who worked for the American Red Cross. She served in Australia, and then she also, after she caught dengue fever, she served in India. And when she caught dengue fever, she was sent to Fiji to recuperate. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1943, decided to take a trip on behalf of the American Red Cross in the South Pacific, and FDR suggested that she wear a Red Cross uniform. That way she wouldn't have to take so many clothes. And so she did. Here's a picture of her signing short snorters. And here's a picture, or I'm sorry, an image of the short snorter that Eleanor Roosevelt signed for Folly Langley. And this was probably signed at the dinner that was given on Mrs. FDR's behalf on the 24th of August, 1943. And then she went, Folly Langley, after she recuperated, she went to Calcutta. And she was there when this USO group came through: Harry Brown, Betty Eaton, Jinx Falkenberg, Pat O'Brien, Ruth Carell, Jimmy Dodd. And here's a picture of Jinx Falkenberg signing a short snorter for some happy tech sergeants in India, 1944. And then also the signatures upon Folly Langley's short snorter of that USO group. And on the other side of that note, there's a bunch of gentlemen that says CNAC after their name. That's China National Aviation Corporation, aka the Hump Flyers. And the gentleman at the top, the second gentleman, R.W. Jenkins, I had the privilege of talking to him on the phone. This is probably about 2009. Has since passed away, of course, like many of the World War II vets. And then this is images from Eleanor Roosevelt when she was signing short snorters in the Canal Zone, and the actual short snorter that was in her wallet upon her passing that she carried with her. It's also signed by a gentleman named Edgar Whitcomb, who was captured and escaped twice from the Japanese. Great book out there, Escape from Corregidor. And he was the 43rd governor of Indiana. Chatted with him on the phone. So I'm going to touch a little bit about vintage commemorative short snorters. And some of these different groups would actually print their own short snorter to commemorate some event. This one was a 458th bomb group who commemorated New Year's 1945 and their 200th mission. This is a short snorter that the image was sent to me, and it's a uniface short snorter. It's only got printing on one side. And it says, Midway Islands, west of everything and east of nothing. There was a lot of short snorters that were printed for the atomic bomb testing down in Bikini Atoll. This is one of those for the USS Sumner. And this was, it was called Operation Crossroads. Here's another example of a different short snorter. This was for Joint Task Force 1. The 58th Wing of the 509th Composite Group. Here's another one, Joint Task Force 1. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the atom bomb testing that happened after World War II, there was 3 different tests scheduled. Able was above the water, Baker was below the water, and Charlie was canceled because of the amount of destruction that Baker had created when it was set to explode. There's a picture of it. You can see those are ships out next to the water column that's being thrown up into the atmosphere. And some of the advertising jumped on the bandwagon with the short snorters. Here's one from Eilerman's department store for the Sky Club. So I'm going to touch a little bit just because of what happened to the tradition. I've been asked and I've kind of come up with a theory. But I'm going to touch a little bit about what the military challenge coins basically replaced the short snorter tradition. Prior to that, even before the short snorters, there was what they called pocket pieces that some of the World War I or some of the folks down on the Mexican border supposedly carried around, and they all have a common background that has this eagle, a heraldic eagle on a shield with some stars above it, and below that says, "Trust in the Lord and keep your powder dry." That saying actually goes back to the time of Oliver Cromwell, the Lord and Protector of England. This is a short snorter that was dated February 14th, 1958. And it was signed by the founder of the Experimental Aircraft Association. And it was presented to a gentleman named Bob Blacker, whose son had sent me this. And you can actually see at the museum in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, this biplane that Bob Blacker and the chartered first youth chapter of the EAA built at St. Rita's High School in Chicago. Lastly, this is the last known press photo mentioning short snorters, and this was January 29, 1958, and it shows 20-year-old Miss Australia, Helen Wood, having her short snorter signed by then New York Mayor Robert Wagner during a visit to City Hall. The photographer asked Miss Wood to remove her shoes so that the mayor could rise to the occasion. And that is all I have. Let me just check real quick. I want to see how much time I have. Okay, I'm going to touch real quick. Joe had asked a question. Joe Bowling asked a question. And recently, there was a short snorter that was donated to me by a gentleman named John Knutson out of Oregon. And he had acquired this from a gentleman named David Miller, who was the nephew of Clyde Crippen, who was with the U.S. Army Air Corps in World War II and flew in the hump. He was a hump flyer, the CBI, over the Himalayas. And he was probably, and I'm going to jump over here and pull up an image. If I can find it, bear with me. I didn't really do my homework on this one too much. Okay, this short snorter, see if I can make this a little bit bigger, was the Hawaii overprint note that was part of that 10 or actually 30 notes that were taped together. And when it arrived on January 23rd of this year, I started examining it, and the first autograph up here, it's really kind of hard to read. I don't know if you can see it or not, the viewers, but it is, oh, there we go. It's signed by a gal named Jean McClellan. And I did a little bit of research, and Jean McClellan was an Australian nurse at Rabaul on January 23rd, 1942, when the Japanese invaded and captured 18 Australian nurse prisoners. And then they took them eventually up to Japan, and they remained POWs until they were liberated after the war was over. And they were the very first group of individuals, POWs, that were liberated by the Allies, the very first group. And there's a gal's signature in here, Etta Jones, and there's a book written about her called Last Letters from Attu that was written by her great niece, Mary Bro. And of those 18 nurses, 15 had signed this short snorter. And in the book, it talks about when they were liberated, what happened after the Japanese surrendered. They started letting the captives out of they could come out of the compounds, and these Australian nurses were out on the road basically when MacArthur's convoy was coming up the road. And MacArthur wasn't actually in the convoy, it was his colonel that was in charge of it. And he saw these gals standing up on the road, wearing paper dresses. They said they look English, and they stopped, and yeah, they're Australian nurses. And Etta Jones was on the island of Attu in May of 42 when the Japanese invaded, and her husband were captured, and he was shot. And then she was sent over to Japan and lived with these Australian nurses. She was quite a bit older than them, so they kind of looked up to her, and she gave them inspiration and courage. And it's just an amazing story that this came to light basically 79 years after they were captured. It was on January 23rd, 2021, when this note was received by me in the mail. And it was on January 23rd, 1942, that these women were captured by the Japanese. And so I work for the Boeing company. There's a gentleman named Mark Donaldson who works for Boeing Defense in Australia. And he's a Victoria Cross recipient, which is a equivalent of Medal of Honor in the United States. And I asked him if he would do the honor of finding a museum in Australia that would take this note as a donation. And so he said, yeah, I know some people. It turns out that the president of Boeing Australia, a gentleman named Brandon Nelson, was the director of the Australian War Memorial for 7 years. And so this note is in Mark's possession. I haven't got an update lately, but he's going to hand deliver it to the Australian War Memorial, and they are really excited to receive it. And it needs to be there, and it needs to tell their story, lest we forget. So having said that, I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Tom, they did not see that last note you were talking about. You left it on the slide for the presentation. I think you would have to exit out of your sharing screen and then go back in and select that. That's it.
Yeah, so that's it. And I was able to basically, I believe there's maybe 2 signatures on here I could not identify, and there's 15 that were with the group that was captured at Rabaul. And let's see. I don't know can you see the picture of the book?
I just see the note.
Okay, let's see if I can do that.
Now we do.
Okay, that's the book that was written, and it's a phenomenal story about Etta Jones and what she experienced during World War II.
All righty. If you're ready for questions, I think we have one at least.
I am ready for questions.
All right. Many short snorter signatures are very hard to read, especially when written over the banknote's design. Do you use any technology to lift the signatures from their background to make them easier to read?
Occasionally, if I have an image where I can adjust some of the contrast, the brightness, things like that, it has helped. But a lot of times I'm looking for a recognizable signature. And over the years, I've, there's certain signatures that I'm able to recognize, like Jinx Falkenberg is pretty easy. And Bob Hope, even though, it's quite the scribble, there's certain signatures that are fairly easy to recognize. But yeah, it's really tough, especially if, you realize that some of these guys, they might have kept this short snorter in their shirt pocket, and they might have been on a 12-hour, 14-hour mission and worked up a real sweat going through a bomb run, and some of that ink is faded or went through the wash or whatever. Yeah, sometimes it can be really, really tough.
All right, let's see this next one. Have you seen any notes with signatures from UNRRA personnel?
UNRRA. I don't know what that stands for.
I'm not sure either. If Steve, if you could type that in the chat or the Q&A, I can read that to Tom and we can see.
Would that be United Nations?
There it is. United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration.
There was something, gosh, I'm trying to remember. This was years ago. There was a short snorter signed by somebody that had something to do with the United Nations. But I don't remember off the top of my head what it was.
All right, any more questions? You can put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'll give it a couple more seconds and then we can close up if there aren't any. Tom, would you mind me sharing your email with Joe Bowling?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you betcha. tjsparks@shortsnorter.org. You share it with anybody you want. And the mission of the project is to educate the general public. So anybody who wants to share the link to the book on the Newman Numismatic Portal is my guest. I would appreciate that very much.
And it was Shortsnorter.
Shortsnorter.org.
Okay.
Yep. tjsparks@shortsnorter.org. Good luck, Joe. I'll vote for you.
All right, so I put that in the chat, so if anybody wants to reach out to Tom, you are more than welcome to, as he's saying. Thank you so much, Tom. That was super interesting. I actually had a coworker come in and sit and listen for a little bit because he's very interested in military history, so he quite enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. We hope to have you back and talking about some more short snorters in the future. For all of you, this will be up on the website hopefully by next week if you want to watch it again or share it with those who didn't get a chance to watch it. You guys all have a great weekend and stay safe.